The fluorescent hum of the checkpoint booth was a constant low thrum in Cole's skull, a sound as ingrained in his existence as the rhythmic thump of a heart. Another passport, another face, another perfunctory question about purpose and duration. He'd seen thousands, tens of thousands of these faces bleed into one another over the years, each bearing a fleeting narrative of escape or return, none of which ever seemed to touch his own. Cole, a customs agent whose life had become a meticulously organized array of dull routines, felt less like a gatekeeper and more like a human barcode scanner. His days were a flat line, punctuated only by the shift changes and the occasional predictable surge of rush-hour traffic. He lived alone, preferred it that way, and found solace in the quiet predictability of his small apartment. The same takeout on the same nights, the same news channel droning into the empty air. There was no joy, no sorrow, just a profound, pervasive sense of nothing. Sometimes, late at night, a flicker of something resembling longing would stir within him, a yearning for a break in the monotony, a jolt, anything to prove he was still capable of feeling. But the feeling would always recede, swallowed by the comfortable inertia. The shrill, insistent ring of his work phone cut through the drone of the checkpoint. Cole blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unexpected sound. He rarely received calls on this line, and never personal ones. He answered, his voice flat, professional. "Agent Thorne, how can Cole help you?" "Mr. Cole Thorne?" A clipped, unfamiliar voice. "This is Marcus Finch, from Finch and Associates. Cole regret to inform you of the passing of your grandmother, Eleanor Thorne." Cole paused, the passport in his hand momentarily forgotten. Eleanor, his grandmother. A distant figure, a woman he hadn't seen in over a decade, barely remembered beyond a faint scent of lavender and old books. He felt no surge of grief, only a quiet surprise, like finding an old, forgotten receipt in a coat pocket. "Oh," he said, the words sounding inadequate, even to himself. "Cole. See, thank you for informing him." Mr. Finch continued, his tone brisk. "She passed peacefully in her sleep last Tuesday. Her will dictates a mandatory reading in person. They've scheduled it for tomorrow afternoon at 3. Their offices are downtown." He provided an address, then added, almost as an afterthought, "There are some unusual stipulations, Mr. Thorne. It would be in your best interest to attend." Unusual stipulations. The phrase echoed in Cole's mind long after he hung up, a tiny crack in the perfectly smooth surface of his stagnant life. He finished his shift on autopilot, the faces of travelers blurring into an indistinguishable stream. The next day, dressed in his least wrinkled suit, he found himself in the hushed, wood-paneled office of Marcus Finch. The lawyer was a severe man with thinning hair and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He wasted no time. "Your grandmother, Eleanor Thorne, was a woman of particular interests," Finch began, shuffling through a stack of documents. "Her estate is modest, but the bulk of it lies in a property she owned, a cabin in a place called Whispering Valley." Cole frowned. "It's quite remote," Finch continued, adjusting his glasses. "No cell service, no paved roads for the last 10 miles. The will stipulates that the cabin and its surrounding acreage, approximately 120 acres, are to be solely inherited by you, Cole Thorne, with one rather unusual condition." Finch paused, looking over the top of his spectacles. "You must reside there for a minimum of 6 months before you are permitted to sell or otherwise dispose of the property. And you are also to receive these." He pushed a small, battered wooden box across the polished desk. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were 5 leather-bound journals, their covers worn smooth with age, their pages yellowed. Their spines bore no titles, only a series of Roman numerals, Cole through V. "Your grandmother's personal journals," Finch explained. "She insisted you be given them immediately upon the reading of the will. She also left this." He handed Cole a thick cream-colored envelope, sealed with a blob of crimson wax. It felt heavy in Cole's hand. Cole looked at the journals, then at the envelope. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, a mandatory 6-month stay, and cryptic journals. It was all so unlike anything he had ever known. A part of him, the part that craved predictability, recoiled. But another long-dormant part felt a faint, almost imperceptible tug. A thread of something new. Finch nodded. Indeed. A rather isolated location. The legal documents stipulate that the property is largely untouched since the early 20th century. No modern utilities to speak of. It's quite the undertaking. Cole opened the envelope. Inside, in Eleanor's spidery, elegant hand, was a single sheet of paper. His dearest Cole. If you are reading this, Cole, I'm gone. And Cole, pray you have the courage Cole lacked. The cabin, the valley, it holds secrets. Secrets Cole spent his life trying to understand, trying to contain. They are old, Cole, older than the trees, older than the mountains. And they are waking up. The journals will guide you. Do not fear what you find there, but respect it. And whatever you do, Cole, do not let them find the others. Your loving grandmother, Eleanor. Cole reread the letter, his brow furrowed. Secrets, waking up. It was absurd, of course. His grandmother, a reclusive old woman, spinning tales. Yet the raw urgency in her words, the stark warning, stirred a peculiar current within him. It wasn't excitement, not exactly. More like a reluctant curiosity, a faint ripple in the still waters of his existence. Perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, something truly unexpected had arrived. And Cole, for all his ingrained inertia, found himself wondering what it might be. Cole reread the letter, his brow furrowed. He folded the aged paper, tucking it into his jacket pocket, and put the old, dilapidated truck into gear. The asphalt quickly gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track barely wider than his vehicle, overgrown with tenacious weeds. The journey into the valley was a descent not just in altitude, but in atmosphere. Civilization thinned out with alarming speed, though the sky above remained stubbornly clear. Cole kept an eye on the GPS, a flickering beacon marking his destination, a dot marooned in a sea of green on the digital map. The road, if one could call it that, wound deeper, past ancient moss-covered rocks that looked like forgotten sentinels. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour, nor a single animal darting across his path. The woods were utterly, eerily devoid of life. Finally, the trees began to thin, revealing a vast, bowl-shaped valley, shrouded in a perpetual twilight. The light here was strange, muted, as if filtered through a layer of unseen gauze. The valley floor was a tapestry of overgrown foliage, vibrant greens and deep purples that seemed too rich, too intense, almost bruised. Amongst them, he noticed patches of flora he couldn't identify. Tall, spindly stalks with large, bell-shaped flowers that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, even in the dim light. They were beautiful, but unnerving, like something from a fever dream. In the heart of this strange landscape, perched precariously on a slight rise overlooking a choked black water pond, stood the cabin. A narrow, crooked path, barely discernible beneath a carpet of strange gray-green moss, led to its front door. The porch sagged, and a single rusted axe was stuck in a chopping block beside a pile of wood that looked untouched for decades. Cole killed the engine. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Inside, the cabin was a time capsule of neglect. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light piercing the grimy windows. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and something else. Something vaguely metallic, like the outside air, but sharper, closer. A single, unmade cot occupied one corner, a rickety table and 2 chairs another. He scanned the room, his gaze snagging on a large wooden chest tucked against the far wall. It wasn't locked. With a grunt, Cole hoisted the heavy lid. Inside, stacked neatly, were dozens of journals. Not just one or two, but a whole library of them, varying in size, color, and binding, some leather, some plain cardboard, all filled with cramped, meticulous handwriting. The sheer volume was staggering, overwhelming. He pulled one out, a slim, red-bound volume. The first few pages detailed mundane observations of weather and local wildlife, written in a clear, steady hand. But as he flipped further, the script grew hurried, the sentences fragmented, peppered with increasingly bizarre observations. The patterns in the moss. They mimic the stars. But the stars here are wrong. He picked up another, a thicker black one. This one was filled with frantic sketches of the luminous plants outside, rendered with an obsessive detail. He skimmed through a third, then a fourth. They weren't just personal diaries. They were a chronicle of growing paranoia and descent into madness. The old man, his uncle, had clearly spent his final years consumed by delusion. References to them, to the others, to the waking, filled the pages, becoming more frequent, more desperate. He read about the valley's unnatural pulse, the wrongness in the air, the things that stir in the deep. He closed the last journal with a decisive snap, placing it back in the chest. It was disturbing, yes, a testament to a mind unraveling in isolation. But credible? He shook his head. The old man had simply gone mad, lost to the solitude in the strange, silent valley. The letter, with its cryptic warnings, was just the final, desperate plea of a man who'd lost his grip. Still, the sheer volume of his uncle's madness, laid bare in these journals, left a lingering sour taste in Cole's mouth. He looked at the window, beyond which the strange, glowing flowers pulsed faintly in the perpetual twilight of the valley. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for a familiar, terrifying play. He needed to break the spell, to ground himself in the present, in the tangible world beyond the cabin's isolating walls. That meant facing the nearest semblance of civilization. 10 miles later, the trees thinned, revealing a cluster of ramshackle buildings, a gas pump listing precariously, a faded sign proclaiming General Store and Bait, and a handful of homes that looked as if they'd been absorbed by the very earth they sat upon. This was the border checkpoint, the last outpost before the true wilderness began, and it felt less like a gateway and more like a barrier. The bell above the general store door jangled, a surprisingly cheerful sound that died instantly in the stale air within. The store was dim, smelling of dust, damp wood, and something vaguely metallic. Shelves were sparsely stocked, mostly with canned goods, fishing tackle, and ancient-looking candy bars. Behind a counter cluttered with receipts and a chipped porcelain mug, an old woman with a face like crumpled parchment watched him with wary, unblinking eyes. "Afternoon," Cole offered, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet. He tried for a friendly smile. "Just moved into the old Miller place up the road." Cole. The woman didn't return the smile. Her gaze was flat, assessing. "Heard you were coming." She nodded vaguely toward the back of the store. "Got what you need?" He picked up a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a small jar of instant coffee. "Just a few essentials for now. How's the winter usually here?" Long, an old man, his face a road map of deep lines, sat hunched on a crate, whittling a piece of gnarled wood. His eyes, though, were sharp, fixed on Cole with an intensity that made the hair on Cole's neck prickle. He wore a faded flannel shirt and suspenders, his hands calloused and knotty. He hadn't made a sound until now. "New blood," the old man rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't look up from his carving, but Cole felt the weight of his gaze. That Miller place. Been empty a long time, for a reason, Cole tried to laugh it off, a nervous sound. "Well, I got a good deal on it. Seems sturdy enough." The old man finally lifted his head, his eyes the color of riverstone meeting Cole's. "Some things ain't about the wood and nails, son. Some places, they got a memory, and they don't take kindly to being forgotten. Especially when the quiet sets in. That's when things start to move." The store proprietress cleared her throat, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Silas, leave the man be. He's just bought some milk." Silas merely grunted, returning to his whittling, but his words hung in the air, thick and cloying as the dust. Cole paid quickly, the pleasant small talk he'd hoped for utterly derailed. The general air of suspicion. Back in the cabin, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruised purples and oranges. He put away his groceries, the mundane task a small anchor in the rising tide of unease. He thought of the journals, of the previous occupant's descent into paranoia. Was he just susceptible now, his mind primed for fear? He decided to light the wood stove, the crackle and warmth of familiar comfort. He went to the small, built-in bookshelf beside the fireplace, intending to grab a novel. He'd left his favorite leather-bound copy of Poe on the top shelf, spine out, ready for easy retrieval. But it wasn't there. He scanned the shelf again, then the one below and the one above. He distinctly remembered placing it there this morning, after he'd finished reading from the journals. He always put his books back neatly. He checked the coffee table, the armchair, even behind the small, worn rug. Then his eyes fell on the lower shelf, tucked away in the very back, half hidden by a stack of old magazines. There it was. Poe. But it wasn't just misplaced. It was upside down, the cover facing the wall. He lived alone. He pulled the book out, his fingers brushing against the cool, worn leather. A trick of the light? A momentary lapse of memory? Or was Silas right? Was the quiet truly starting to move things? The cabin, which had felt so empty moments ago, now felt watched. Cole stared at it, a tremor running through his hand. He hadn't touched it since morning. There was no one else. He pulled the book out, its spine creaking, a thin layer of dust disturbing the air. The old journal, his grandmother's, suddenly felt like a lifeline in a storm of impossible occurrences. The inexplicable movement of the book, the unsettling stillness that followed, had shattered his carefully constructed reality. What if his grandmother hadn't been mad? What if she had been trying to tell them something? He needed answers, and the faded ink on these brittle pages seemed his only hope. He started where he'd left off, but his eyes were drawn to the margins, to the strange angular symbols that recurred with increasing frequency. Jagged lines that seemed to claw at the page, a single, unblinking eye staring out from a web of intricate patterns, and a broken circle, always incomplete, always yearning. They weren't decorative. They were deliberate, urgent. The listener. The phrase appeared dozens of times, sometimes alone, sometimes nestled in frantic warnings. It was never described visually, only by its function, its insatiable hunger. It knows our fears before we voice them. He imagined something vast and invisible, a presence that permeated the very air, a silent predator of the soul. He read of the veil, a concept far more abstract, but no less terrifying. His grandmother described it as a thin membrane, a permeable barrier between here and there. This valley, she'd scrawled in a particularly frantic entry, it's where the veil thins, where the separation frays. They can reach through. They do reach through. He remembered her strange, almost obsessive gardening, her insistence on specific herbs planted in precise patterns around the house. Had she been trying to mend the veil or reinforce it? A sudden, sharp rap came from the kitchen like a knuckle striking wood. Cole froze, breath catching in his throat. He told himself it was the old house settling, the wind. He forced his eyes back to the journal, his heart hammering against his ribs. His grandmother detailed them not as agricultural seasons, but as periods of intensified activity, linked to the lunar cycle, to the turning of the earth. The harvest is not of grain, but of despair, of fear, of what is taken when the veil is weakest. There were oblique references to offerings, to the tribute paid by the unwary, and to a great hunger that must be sated lest it consume us all. A memory surfaced, sharp and disquieting. He was a boy, maybe 7 or 8, in the back seat of his grandmother's old sedan. They were driving back from a day trip nearing the edge of the valley, a makeshift border checkpoint set up by the local sheriff for some forgotten reason. His grandmother had gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She'd stared straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking, muttering to herself, "Almost through. Almost past the threshold." She'd sped up, ignoring the slow down sign, her face a mask of primal fear until they were well past the dusty barricade. He'd dismissed it as one of her episodes. But now, reading about the veil and thresholds, the memory took on a sinister new light. Had she been fleeing something more than a sheriff's casual inspection? He could see his breath, a faint wisp in the fading light, a faint cloying scent, like wet earth and something else. Something metallic and ancient filled his nostrils. It wasn't imagination. This was real. His grandmother's final entries were almost illegible, a frantic scrawl of warnings and pleas. Don't listen to the quiet. They are always there, watching, waiting for the harvest. He was no longer just reading about his grandmother's madness. He was living it. They were proof. The valley wasn't just his home. It was a prison, and he, like his grandmother, was now marked. He was heard, he was known, and the harvest, whatever it truly entailed, was coming. The words clawed at his mind. The threshold, the ancient stones, the communion. He had to see it, had to prove it wasn't real, or prove that it was. He grabbed his pack, his flashlight, and the worn, leather-bound journal, its pages now feeling unnervingly warm in his grip. His grandmother's scrawled directions, once dismissed as deluded fantasy, now shone with a terrible clarity. They led to the deepest, most isolated part of the valley, beyond a place she called the Sentinel's Gate. The drive was a descent into an older world. The paved road soon gave way to cracked asphalt, then to a gravel track choked with weeds. He found the Sentinel's Gate exactly as she described, a crumbling, forgotten border checkpoint. 2 stone pillars, once perhaps grand, now leaned precariously, their surfaces covered in ancient, indecipherable carvings that looked less like human art and more like scars. A rusted, half-open iron gate groaned on its hinges, swaying faintly in a breeze that Cole couldn't feel. The small, squat building beside it was a ruin, its windows shattered, its door hanging ajar like a gaping maw. This wasn't a place that kept things out. It was a place that guarded what lay within. Parking his car out of sight behind a thick stand of pines, Cole stepped out. The valley hummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a thrumming beneath his feet that made his teeth ache. He felt eyes on him, not physical eyes, but a pervasive awareness that prickled his skin. The valley wasn't just malevolent. It felt actively, maliciously alive. Following the journal's crude map, he struck out on foot, pushing through thorny undergrowth and clambering over moss-slicked rocks. The path was barely discernible, a faint deer trail that seemed to twist and turn with no logic, yet always leading him deeper, higher. The forest canopy was so dense that twilight seemed to fall prematurely, bathing the world in sickly greens and bruised purples. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, he saw it. A clearing, ancient and overgrown, dominated by a circle of standing stones. They weren't massive like Stonehenge, but tall, jagged teeth ripped from the earth, their surfaces pitted and worn by millennia of wind and rain. Yet, they were not natural. This wasn't just an old landmark. It was a stage. A cloying metallic scent hung heavy in the air, overpowering the smell of damp earth and pine. He didn't need a detective's eye to know what it was. Blood. Recent. His breath hitched. He wasn't alone. A low, guttural chanting began, a sound that seemed to rise from the very stones themselves, vibrating through the ground and up into his bones. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, accompanied by a soft, insistent thudding, like a muffled drum. He instinctively dropped to his knees, pressing himself against the gnarled roots of a massive oak, peering through the undergrowth. Figures, cloaked and hooded, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. They were barely visible in the deepening gloom, their forms indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. They moved around the altar, their voices rising and falling in that alien chant, their movements synchronized, terrifyingly precise. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the valley's ancient rhythm. He dared not move, dared not breathe too loudly. The valley felt like a predator, and he, its unwitting prey. One of the figures reached down, placing something on the altar. The chant intensified, peaking in a crescendo of sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ceased. Cole waited, frozen, until he was sure they were gone. Slowly, painstakingly, he crawled forward, his eyes fixed on the altar. The green light faded, leaving only the dull gleam of the recent bloodstains. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom. On the altar, Ware had placed something, lay a small idol. Its surface was smooth, polished, and still felt warm to the touch. It was not merely an artifact. It radiated a palpable wrongness, a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. Tangible evidence. This was it. Cole carefully picked it up, the weight of it in his hand feeling like a curse. It was proof. Proof of the cult, proof of the rituals, proof that his grandmother hadn't been mad, only terrified. He backed away, slowly at first, then scrambling, crashing through the undergrowth, the idol clutched tight in his hand. The valley seemed to watch his retreat, the trees pressing in, the air thick with an unseen presence that seemed to follow his every step. He didn't look back. Cole's breath tore in his throat, each gasp a ragged saw blade. He didn't know where he was going, only that it had to be away. The undergrowth clawed at his clothes, his skin, but he barely registered the pain. The idol, still clutched in his hand, felt suddenly, intensely hot, as if it had absorbed the very heat of his fear. It pulsed against his palm. He burst from the tree line, stumbling into the clearing. The border checkpoint, a skeletal sentinel, stood before him against the bruised twilight sky. It was exactly as he remembered. The dilapidated shack, the rusted boom gate hanging askew, the faded stop sign peeling. The idol in his hand flared, not with light, but with a sudden, profound pressure. It wasn't just hot now. It thrummed with an energy that vibrated through his bones. The world fractured. The checkpoint dissolved, then reformed. Not as it was, but as it had been. Or perhaps as it truly was. The boom gate was intact, barricaded with heavy timbers, scored with what looked like axe marks. The air reeked of ozone and something metallic like old blood. And then he saw her. Younger, her face already etched with a desperation he'd never seen. She wasn't just standing. She was fighting. Her hands, gnarled even then, pressed against the checkpoint's walls, smearing them with intricate symbols drawn in a shimmering crimson substance. Her eyes, wide and wild, darted back and forth, not with madness, but with fierce, terrible resolve. He was a ghost, a silent observer in this spectral tableau. He tried to call out, but no sound escaped. He was there, yet not. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid earth, but a shifting current of time. He saw flashes. The valley, not a tranquil haven, but a wound. People, faceless figures toiling in fields, their movements slow, almost ritualistic, their eyes vacant. Not farmers, offerings. He saw her grow, her hair turning prematurely white, her back bending not from age, but from the weight of a terrible knowledge, a constant struggle. She wasn't building a home. She was building a cage, painstakingly reinforcing the valley's borders, not to keep people out, but to keep something in. He'd watched her at the checkpoint again, her breath misting in the twilight, her eyes scanning the empty road, not with impatience, but with a kind of resigned vigilance. The older man, a familiar, stoic fixture, stood beside her, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. They were guardians. But of what? And from what? The question had gnawed at him for days, weeks even, twisting his sanity into a knot. He had to leave. Now. He waited until the last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Then, with a decisive click of the ignition, he started his car. He drove, not towards the town he'd come to despise, but towards the narrow pass that was his only escape. The checkpoint. His headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the familiar stretch of asphalt. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, a knot of anticipation tightening in his chest. He imagined the girl's surprised expression, the man's slow, assessing gaze. He would be firm, polite, but unyielding. He had his papers. He had his resolve. But as he rounded the final bend, the one that should have brought the checkpoint into view, his foot instinctively slammed on the brake. The tires shrieked, the car fishtailing slightly before shuddering to a halt. His headlights illuminated not the weathered wooden barrier, not the girl, not the man, but a gaping, jagged maw in the earth. The road, as if sliced by an unseen knife, simply ended. There was no checkpoint, no barrier, no human presence. Cole stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes saw. He'd driven this road countless times. The pass had always been solid, if narrow. Now it was as if a giant had taken a bite out of the mountain. He walked to the edge, peering into the inky blackness. No bottom. It was too precise, too clean a break to be a natural rock slide. This was deliberate. He tried to think. There was an old logging trail, barely marked on his outdated map, that supposedly looped around the higher peaks, eventually rejoining the main highway far beyond the valley. It was treacherous, unmaintained, but it was his only other option. He turned the car around, the tires crunching on the gravel. As he drove back through the foothills, he noticed them. Figures, indistinct in the deepening gloom, standing on the higher ridges, silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight. Not moving, just watching. Their presence, silent and still, felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. He found the turnoff for the logging trail, a barely visible track overgrown with thorny bushes. He engaged the four-wheel drive, the vehicle lurching and bouncing over the uneven terrain. The trail narrowed quickly, trees pressing in from both sides, their branches scraping against the car's paint. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet. Suddenly, the path ahead was gone. Not a fissure this time, but a wall of dense, thorny undergrowth, thicker than anything he'd seen before, impossibly high, as if it had sprung up overnight. It wasn't just overgrown. It was a living, breathing barricade, its tendrils seeming to writhe in the beam of his headlights. He tried to push through, but the car groaned, the engine straining, the branches tearing at the metal. It was impenetrable. He backed up, heart pounding, the irrationality of it all setting his teeth on edge. The valley was fighting him, actively. He tried another direction, a faint deer path he'd once noticed. He felt utterly lost, disoriented, the compass on his dash spinning wildly, useless. He slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning, desperate to escape the suffocating embrace of the forest. He broke free, back onto the main, albeit blocked, road. He drove back towards the town, defeated, the horror of his situation settling over him like a shroud. The usual evening bustle was absent. Only a few figures were out, and they weren't going about their business. They stood, singly or in small groups, on their porches, in their doorways, at the corners of the streets, and they were all looking at him. No waves, no smiles, just an unnerving, unified gaze that followed his car as he drove past. Their faces were impassive, but their eyes held something new, an open, almost triumphant malevolence. He saw the old butcher, Mr. Abernathy, standing in front of his shop, his cleaver glinting in the dim light. He didn't wave. He simply watched, a faint, knowing smirk playing on his lips. Cole parked his car near the decrepit hotel, the only place he felt marginally safe. He looked up at the moon, now a full, bloated orb hanging low in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the valley. It looked different tonight, larger, closer. A shiver ran down his spine. The air felt charged, expectant. He was trapped, truly trapped. The valley was a living entity, a cage with a will of its own. And in the eyes of the locals, in the silent, knowing gesture of the butcher, he finally understood. The harvest was not just a season. It was a countdown. And he was very much a part of it. He was no longer in the crude confines of a shed, but dragged, half-conscious, through a narrow, winding path that terminated at what could only be described as a gate. It wasn't a modern border checkpoint, not with its crumbling, moss-slicked archway of cyclopean stones, ancient and worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. This was a threshold, a maw leading deeper into the valley's heart, an entrance to something far older than any human concept of a border. These weren't the simple, rustic folk he'd first encountered. A low, guttural hum began, rising from the assembled cultists like a sound pulled from the very earth. It wasn't a chant with discernible words, but a resonant vibration that seeped into Cole's bones, making his teeth ache and his vision swim. He struggled, a fresh wave of panic surging through his veins, but the hands that held him were impossibly strong, their grip unyielding. They pushed him forward, through the ancient archway, into a vast, natural amphitheater carved into the side of the mountain. Primordial force. And upon it, carved deep into its surface, was a symbol. Intricate, alien, and utterly horrifying. It looked like a knot of grasping tendrils, or perhaps an impossible, contorted face, its features shifting in the periphery of his vision. The hum intensified, joined now by the soft, rhythmic shuffling of feet as the cultists began to move in a slow, deliberate circle around the dais. Their eyes, all of them, were fixed on Cole. This wasn't just a ceremony he was witnessing. He was the focal point, the reason. He was dragged onto the dais, his feet scraping against the rough stone. His face was obscured by a hood, but Cole could feel the weight of his gaze, an ancient, knowing malevolence. The harvest. The hooded figure's voice rasped, a sound like stones grinding together. Begins. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't about death. This was about something far, far worse. The hooded figure raised his hands. In his left, he held a wickedly curved blade of obsidian, gleaming with an unnatural luster. The valley hungers, the voice continued, echoing off the stone walls of the amphitheater. It sleeps, but it hungers. For centuries it has waited, for the pure, for the unburdened, for the vessel to make it whole again. Cole stared, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the horrifying words. Vessel? The cultists around the circle began to sway, a slow, hypnotic movement. Their faces, contorted in rapturous devotion, were no longer human. Their eyes held a disturbing, reflective sheen, as if something ancient and terrible peered out from behind them. "You, outsider," the hooded figure said, his gaze piercing Cole, "are the chosen. Untainted by their ways, strong in spirit, you are the perfect shell. The valley will take what it needs. It will fill you, and through you, it will walk the world once more." The grotesque truth slammed into Cole with the force of a physical blow. The valley wasn't just a place. It was the entity itself, or its prison, or its dormant form. And it wasn't a sacrifice of his life they sought, but of his very being. He was to be a puppet, a conduit for something primordial and monstrous to return. The harvest wasn't blood. It was his mind, his soul, his identity, to be consumed and replaced, seeking purchase. He wasn't just an observer. He was the field, the crop, the living, breathing gateway for the valley's monstrous awakening. And the horror was only just beginning to bloom. The obsidian blade, a shard of night made solid, pulsed faintly. A dull, internal light that seemed to draw all warmth, all hope from the air. Around him, the cultists' chanting surged, a guttural, rhythmic drone that vibrated in his teeth, his skull, his very soul. Their faces, contorted masks of fanaticism, blurred at the edges of his vision. Then the world twisted. It began subtly. The stone floor beneath him seemed to ripple, as if it were water, not solid rock. The walls of the old guardhouse, previously sturdy and rectangular, began to warp, their lines bending and curving into impossible geometries. Angles sharpened where they shouldn't, corners dissolved into an infinite stretch, and his peripheral vision caught glimpses of colors that defied description hues that were both there and not there, like reflections from a dimension just beyond his grasp. The pressure inside Cole became unbearable, a scream building in his throat that couldn't escape. It wasn't just physical, it was existential. He felt his consciousness itself being stretched, pulled thin, as if his mind were a fragile membrane on the verge of tearing. The entity was no longer just a looming presence. It was here, manifesting not as a single form, but as a distortion of reality itself, a tear in the fabric of existence. He saw it, or rather, felt it. Not with his eyes, but with something deeper, something primal, a vastness, an impossible scale, yet neither. It was a being of pure, incomprehensible influence, a horror that didn't just threaten his life, but his very sanity, his understanding of what was. But beneath it, a desperate spark ignited. He couldn't just lie there and let this happen. He was human, and he would fight. With a guttural roar that tore through the chanting, Cole thrashed, a desperate, convulsive struggle against the ropes that bound him. His muscles screamed in protest, but the surge of adrenaline was like fire. He twisted, trying to throw his weight, to dislodge himself, to disrupt the ritual, anything to break the entity's hold. He focused on the obsidian blade, inches above him, the conduit of this horror. If he could just knock it away, break the connection. One of the cultists, a hulking figure with eyes wide and vacant, lunged, pressing a heavy boot onto Cole's shoulder, pinning him more firmly. The chanting faltered for a moment, then resumed with renewed ferocity, as if fueled by his resistance. Her eyes, fixed on the blade, glowed with an unnatural light. Cole ignored her, straining against the ropes, his vision blurring with effort and the impossible, shifting reality around him. He could feel the entity's influence pressing down, like a mountain falling on his soul. The pressure on his chest intensified, not from the blade, but from the unseen force that was coalescing, solidifying, directly above him. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but in the deepest, most terrified part of his being. The impossible geometries above him began to coalesce, to fold in on themselves, forming an inverted vortex of pure blackness. Non-colors that pulsed with malevolent ancient intent. It was an eye that had seen the birth and death of stars, an eye that held the secrets of an indifferent, vast cosmos. Cole's struggle faltered. His mind, already stretched to breaking, threatened to snap. He was a moth fluttering against the face of a mountain, a fleeting thought in the mind of a god, crushing him beneath the indifferent gaze of an entity that predated all life, all understanding. Slowly, inexorably, it moved towards his chest, not to pierce his flesh, but to open a gateway, to merge him with the horror that now filled the checkpoint. The obsidian blade, responding to the immense alien presence now fully manifesting, began to descend. Slowly, inexorably, it moved towards his chest, not a weapon of pain, but a key. Cole felt no fear, only a profound, terrifying certainty. His breath hitched, not from anticipation of a wound, but from the dawning realization of what was to come. The air around him shimmered, warping the very fabric of the checkpoint's dilapidated structure, turning the rusted gate and the crumbling shack into phantoms of their former selves. The entity was not just present. It was everywhere, seeping into the stone, the earth, the very air. The tip of the blade touched his skin, cool and impossibly smooth. There was no resistance, no puncture. Instead, it felt as though his flesh simply yielded, dissolving into an ethereal mist. The blade didn't enter him. He entered the blade. Or perhaps, the blade entered everything. A searing, silent scream erupted in Cole's mind, not of pain, but of absolute dissolution. His senses overloaded. He was falling, yet suspended. He was expanding, yet shrinking. The boundaries of his body, his mind, his very identity began to fray. Memories, thoughts, emotions, all the intricate threads that wove together the tapestry of Cole, snapped, one by one, then in accelerating multitudes. His childhood home, the scent of rain, the face of his mother, the warmth of a forgotten touch. They flashed and then dissolved into an incomprehensible torrent of data, alien sensations, and ancient, unutterable truths. He was no longer just Cole. He was the valley, the mountain, the sky above it. He was the root systems beneath the earth, the silent flow of subterranean rivers, the crushing weight of geological time. His mind, once a contained vessel, became an open sea, battered by waves of unfathomable understanding. He saw the world not as humans perceived it, but as a thin, fragile veil over a reality far more vast, more intricate, and infinitely more indifferent. He comprehended the true nature of the border checkpoint. Not a barrier between lands, but a threshold between states of being. A place of deliberate thinning, where the membrane between worlds grew porous. He saw the endless cycle, the ebb and flow of the entity's influence, the regular harvesting, the constant low thrum of its slumbering awareness. The entity's presence was not a voice, but a permeating thought, a colossal, ancient consciousness that settled into the vacant spaces of Cole's fractured mind. It did not consume him entirely. It absorbed him, integrated him, repurposed him. He was a new nerve ending, an expanded sensory organ, a conscious extension of its will. When the dizzying maelstrom subsided, Cole found himself standing precisely where he had been, yet utterly changed. His body felt solid, tangible, but it was a shell, animated by a different current. His eyes, when he blinked, no longer perceived the world through human lenses. The faded sign above the gate now pulsed with a faint internal light, a beacon to something unseen. The dust motes in the air were tiny, dancing conduits of energy. He raised a hand, observing the skin, the veins, the familiar lines. But the hand was not his. It was a tool, capable of intricate manipulations he now understood instinctively. He looked toward the distant, fog-shrouded peaks and felt an immense, ancient connection. He was the valley's new keeper. He was the one who would maintain the threshold, who would ensure the flow, who would beckon the lost, the desperate, the curious, just as he had been beckoned. The detective, if he were to return, would find the checkpoint exactly as he left it. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would glimpse, standing unnaturally still amidst the encroaching fog, eyes that held the depth of ancient stone, observing, always observing. Cole, or what remained of him, stood at the threshold, an eternal sentinel. His individual will was a forgotten echo. He was the mouth of the valley, the silent invitation, the patient collector. The cycle continued, unbroken, unburdened by human resistance. He was the gate, he was the key, he was the valley, and he would wait. The fog, thick and gray, began to roll in from the peaks, slowly enveloping the checkpoint, obscuring the path, swallowing the world beyond. Within its embrace, the new keeper stood, a silent monument to the unyielding, unknowable power that governed this forgotten corner of the world. The valley breathed, and Cole, its new lungs, breathed with it, a breath that promised no end, only continuation.